we are very privileged to be with you, particularly our brothers and sisters from the Caribbean and the diaspora, and people from all over Africa, our brothers and sisters from all over Africa. I wish at this point to particularly to apologize deeply on behalf of the chiefs and people of Gold Coast and Ghana for the atrocities, the cruelty, the inhuman treatment that were committed 400 years ago by my ancestors during the Atlantic slave trade, where over 400 years ago, millions of our brothers and sisters were captured, sold, and transported under inhumane and cruel circumstances through Elmina Castle across to the Caribbean and to the New World. On behalf of the chiefs and people of Ghana, I do render unqualified apology, deep from the bottom of our hearts. Deep from our bottom of our hearts. But one thing that I want you to be aware of, it was not without resistance. Some of our chiefs did fought and resisted. Some of our people did fought and resisted. But we are fighting a losing battle against a stronger army. People with guns, and we had no guns. They deceived us with liquor and all other temptations. Whatever the circumstances that led it to us, we stand here to render apology. And it's my wish and prayer that this apology is accepted. It's accepted deep by our brothers and sisters from the diaspora. May the blood of Jesus assist us to overcome that evil, that never again should we witness this cruelty, this inhuman cruelty of man to man in this country. I thank you, and once again, on behalf of the chiefs and people of Ghana, we do render this apology.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Right, peace my people. Before I start, I would like to say that it's against human rights what they have done. They are criminals, but we have those very same masters still keeping us all in 21st century slavery. We need to unite, and the ones that don't, then fuck them, let them carry on. So many Americans mistakenly believed that most slaves were captured by Europeans who landed on the African coast and captured or ambushed people. It is important to understand that Europeans were incapable on their own of kidnapping 20 million Africans. Most slaves sold to Europeans had not been slaves in Africa. They were free people who were captured in war, or were victims of banditry, or were enslaved as punishment for certain crimes or as a repayment for a debt. In most cases, rulers and merchants were not selling their own subjects, but people they regarded as alien. Apologists for the African slave trade long argued that European traders purchased Africans who had already been enslaved and who otherwise would have been put to death. Thus, apologists claimed the slave trade actually saved lives. This is a serious distortion of the facts. Some independent slave merchants did stage raids on unprotected African villages and kidnapped enslaved Africans. The professional slave traders, however, set up bases along the West African coast where they purchased slaves from Africans in exchange for firearms and other goods. Before the end of the 17th century, England, France, Denmark, Holland and Portugal had all established slave trading posts on the West African coast. The massive European demand for slaves and the introduction of firearms radically transformed West African society. A growing number of Africans were enslaved for petty debts or minor criminal or religious offences, or following unprovoked raids on unprotected villages. An increasing number of religious wars broke out with goal of capturing slaves. European weapons made it easier to capture slaves. Some African societies like Benin in southern Nigeria refused to sell slaves. Others like Dahomey appear to have specialised in enslavement. Drought, famine or periods of violent conflict might lead a ruler or a merchant to sell slaves. In addition, many rulers sold slaves in order to acquire their trade goods, textiles, alcohol and other rare imports that were necessary to secure the loyalty of their subjects. After capture, the captives were bound together at the neck and marched barefoot hundreds of miles to the Atlantic coast. African captives typically suffered death rates of 20% or more while being marched overland. Observers reported seeing hundreds of skeletons along the slave caravan routes at the coast. The captives were held in pens known as barracoons, guarded by dogs. Our best guess is that another 15 to 30% of Africans died during capture, the march from the interior, or the wait for the slave ships along the coast. Between 10 and 16 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic between 1500 and 1900, but this figure grossly understates the actual number of Africans enslaved, killed or displaced as a result of the slave trade. At least 2 million Africans, 10 to 15%, died during the infamous Middle Passage across the Atlantic. Another 15 to 30% died during the march to or confinement along the coast. So altogether then, for every 100 slaves who reached the New World, 40 died in Africa or during the Middle Passage. On shipboard, slaves were chained together and crammed into spaces sometimes less than 5 feet high. Conditions within the slave ships were unspeakably awful. Inside the hold, slaves had only half their space provided for indentured servants or convicts. Urine, vomit, mucus and horrific odours filled the hold. The Middle Passage usually took more than 7 weeks. Men and women were separated, with men usually placed toward the bow and women towards the stern. The men were chained together and forced to lie shoulder to shoulder. During the voyage, the enslaved Africans were usually fed only once or twice a day and brought on deck for limited times. The death rate on these slave ships were very high, reaching 25% in the 17th and early 18th century. It remained around 10% in the 19th century as a result of malnutrition and such diseases as dysentery, measles, scurvy and smallpox. The most serious danger was dehydration due to inadequate water rations. Diarrhea was widespread and many Africans arrived in the New World covered with sores or suffering fevers. Many Africans resisted enslavement on shipboard. Many slaves attempted suicide, jumped overboard or refused to eat. Our best estimate is that there was a revolt on 1 in every 10 voyages across the Atlantic. The level of slave exports grew from about 36,000 a year in the early 18th century to almost 80,000 a year during the 1780s. By 1750, slavers usually contained at least 400 slaves, with some carrying more than 700. During the peak years of the slave trade between 1740 and 1810, Africa supplied 60,000 captives a year, outnumbering Europeans migrating to the New World. African chiefs urged to apologise for the slave trade. Nigerian civil rights group says tribal leaders' ancestors sold people to slavers and should say sorry like the US and Britain. Slave trade shackles. Shackles used to capture people to be sold into slavery. In Africa in the 18th century, African tribal leaders have been ordered to apologise for the role of their ancestors in the transatlantic trade. Traditional African rulers whose ancestors collaborated with Europeans and Arab slaves traders should follow Britain and the United States by publicly saying sorry, according to Human Rights Organization. The Civil Rights of Congress of Nigeria has written to the tribal chiefs saying we cannot continue to blame the white man, as Africans, particularly the traditional rulers, are not blameless. The appeal has reopened a sensitive debate over the part some chiefs played in helping to capture their fellow Africans and sell them into bondage as part of the transatlantic slave trade. The Congress argued that the ancestors of the chiefs had helped to raid and kidnap defenceless communities and traded them to Europeans. They should now apologise to put a final seal to the history of slave trade. It said in view of the fact that the Americans and Europe have accepted the cruelty of their roles and have forcefully apologised, it would be logical, reasonable and humbling if African traditional rulers can accept, blame and formally apologise to the descendants of the victims of their collaborative and exploitative slave trade. So estimates vary that between 10 million and 28 million Africans were sent to the Americas and sold into slavery between 1450 and the early 19th century. More than 1 million are believed to have died in transit across the so-called Middle Passage of the Atlantic due to inhumane conditions aboard slave ships and the brutal crushing of any resistance. 3 years ago, Tony Blair described Britain's participation as a crime against humanity and expressed his deep sorrow. The US Senate voted for an apology this year, which is 10 years ago from this date. This article came out, and Tony Blair's a war criminal anyway. Shehu Sani, head of the Congress, said it was calling for traditional rulers to apologise now because they were seeking inclusion in a forthcoming constitutional amendment in Nigeria. We felt that for them to have the moral standing to be part of our constitutional arrangement, there are some historical issues for them to address. He told the BBC World Service, one part of which is in the involvement of their institutions in the slave trade. He said that on behalf of the buyers of slaves, the ancestors of the traditional rulers raided communities and kidnapped people, shipping them away across the Sahara or across the Atlantic. Many slaves captured inland in Africa died on a long journey to the coast. The position was endorsed by Henry Bunsu, a British-born broadcaster of Ghanaian descent who examined the issue in Ghana for a radio documentary. He said some chiefs had accepted responsibility and sought atonement by visiting Liverpool and the United States. I interviewed a chief who acknowledged there was collaboration and that without that involvement we wouldn't have seen human trafficking on an industrial scale, said Bunsu, the co-founder of digital station Colourful Radio. An apology in Nigeria might be helpful because the chiefs did some terrible things and abetted a major crime. The non-government organisation African Human Rights Heritage, based in Accra, Ghana, supports the campaign for an apology. Balfour Anin, its chief executive, said, "I certainly agree with the Nigeria Civil Rights Congress that the traditional leaders should render an apology for their role in the inhumane slavery administration." He said it would accord with the UN's position on human rights. But the issue was not a high priority for most African citizens, according to Bonzo. "In my experience, it's mainly the African diaspora who want an apology. People aren't milling around Lagos or Accra moaning about why chiefs don't apologise. They are more concerned about the everyday and why they still have bad governance." Fred Swanika, the founder of the African Leadership Academy, said, "I'm not sure whether an apology is needed, but it would be worth looking at and acknowledging the role Africa did play in the slave trade. Someone had to find the slaves and bring them before the Europeans." The shameful history of some traditional leaders remains an awkward subject on which many politicians prefer to maintain silence. One exception was in 1998 when Yoweri Museveni, the president of Uganda, told an audience including Bill Clinton African chiefs were the ones waging war on each other and capturing their own people and selling them. "If anyone should apologise, it should be the African chiefs. We still have those traitors here even today." Slavery is any system in which principles of property law are applied to people, allowing individuals to own, buy and sell other individuals as a form of property. A slave is unable to withdraw unilaterally from such an arrangement and works without remuneration. So many scholars now use the term chattel slavery to refer to this specific sense of legalized slavery. In a broader sense, however, the word slavery may also refer to any situation in which an individual is de facto forced to work against their own will. Scholars also use the more generic terms such as unfree labour or forced labour to refer to such situations. However, and especially under slavery in broader senses of the word, slaves may have some rights and protections according to laws or customs. Slavery existed in many cultures dating back to early human civilizations. A person could become enslaved from the time of their birth, capture or purchase. Slavery was legal in most societies at some time in the past, but is now outlawed in all recognized countries. The last country to officially abolish slavery was Mauritania in 1981. Nevertheless, there are an estimated 40.3 million people worldwide subject to some form of modern slavery. The most common form of modern slave trade is commonly referred to as human trafficking. In other areas, slavery continues through practices such as debt bondage. The most widespread form of slavery today, serfdom, domestic servants kept in captivity, certain adoptions in which children are forced to work as slaves, child soldiers, and forced marriages, taxes, forced vaccinations, and the list is endless. So we are all slaves. We are all slaves. We often overlook the meaning of the word slave. We most often connect it with Africans enslaved by Europeans and brought to foreign lands to work against their will. While this was indeed an atrocity and it's since been abolished, there is still slavery that runs rampant in the world. No matter how developed a country or nation may seem, all of its citizens are slaves. In the very land that preaches freedom and democracy, we are still slaves. So this type of statement would normally have most people up in arms. That I'd overlook the sinister history of slavery and go as far as saying that we are all slaves. If we would all put our bickering aside and stop conflicting with each other, we would be able to see what I'm talking about. The modern slaveholder holds no whip, or calls their slaves by a slur or remark. The modern slaveholder does not even have a face with which to look his slaves in the eye. When I saw that we are all slaves, I want to focus on a definition of the word slave. According to the Merriam-Webster, a slave is a person held in servitude to the chattel of another. So this means that a slave is someone commanded to do something in subservience to a dominant power. If our everyday lives were to be analysed closely, we can see that we are all held as slaves. Every person that claims citizenship in a country is required to pay taxes. We are all required to pay for a place to stay. We have to pay for food, water and anything else under the sun except the air. But that's just because they haven't figured out a way to calculate the rates. How do we afford it? By working 40 hours a week and earning your daily bread. People would argue that it's not slavery at all. We're being compensated for it. Yes, you are being compensated for it, but you still have to hand off that money in some way or the other, and you still have to do something you have no real desire to do. We do all of this just so that someone all the way up on the corporative food chain can profit off you and keep himself in power so that he can keep you enslaved. We are even slaves to each other. Are the words that we speak not dictated by social environments? If we're amongst the elderly, would you dare to utter such dirty speech that you expel when you're with your friends? Men feel pressure to act overly masculine when there's no need for competition, but they are incited to do so because of the norms set by our peers. Women feel the need to look prettier than their affiliates when there's also no need for competition. We're slaves to norms that have been set since before we were born. We're even slaves to the media. The left tells us what we should accept, everyone, and that social programs are beneficial, while the right tells us that we shouldn't let people marry others because of their beliefs and their corporations are great. We cling to these ideas and are held as slaves to them, only to bicker with the opposing slaves. Instead of living independently, we choose to let ourselves be subdued by all these social shackles. Some say freedom and order cannot coexist, and they are right. It's because our minds are enslaved to think so. Instead of helping the community grow, as well as lead lives as individuals in our own spheres, we are divided by all of the slaveholders. While we can blame the man all we want, the fault lies in ourselves. for allowing this subservience to persist when it's clearly visible and we can stop it. It's truly tragic. I'd like anyone to tell me how my existence as a white guy being brought up in a working class environment in London, how my being in some way has impacted you negatively and has affected your life. How about all the people that exist? How has their existence affected your life? Explain that to me. How about the people that are eating out of food banks or homeless with no work trying to scrape? What about babies, children? How is their existence affecting your life? And remember, this is not aimed at all, just a few that are thugs and criminals, thieves and murderers, hurting and killing innocent people because they're from a different culture or background. I'm talking to all groups, EDL, BLM and police everywhere. The slave masters of all of us is still there today, yet we fight amongst ourselves like 5-year-olds in adult bodies. Listen, we are all, we all know we will die one day. What have you prepared for that day? This is identity politics and virtual signaling, which is to divide and conquer. You keep banging on about slavery. We are all in slavery, including you. None of us are free from it. This is frustrating, concerning, depressing when we see the narrative being pushed out there by these mainstream channels, by the establishment, and then being absorbed like a sponge by the general public. This is a classic divide and conquer strategy that we are falling into, to keep us so busy fighting over things, whether race, religion, gender, identity, politics, whatever you name it, and we don't see how we are being targeted by the same system of oppression. So please listen to what I'm actually saying, not what you want to believe I am saying. So now we're gonna address from a Quranic perspective. So slavery is a very old practice that was gradually abolished in Islam. Many people out of ignorance or out of bias attack Islam, obviously, submission, for its stand on slavery, distorting and misrepresenting the true stand of Islam, submission. So we will see the great humane position of Islam on slavery. The central issue of slavery and equality is the concept of human dignity in Islam. God has conferred honour and dignity on all human beings, irrespective of their race, gender, age, social status and beliefs. In chapter 17 verse 70, God says, "We have honoured the children of Adam and provided them with rights on land and in sea. We provided for them good provisions and we gave them greater advantages than many of our creatures." Together with human dignity and honour comes freedom to live, the right to be respected on an equal basis before the law, and to enjoy equal social treatment. Islam stresses the equality of mankind as God created man from a common source, and the only allegiance and obedience is to God, the Almighty Creator. Islam has never condoned any form of discrimination. The only thing that sets man apart is their righteousness. In chapter 49 verse 13, "O people, we created you from the same male and female and rendered you distinct people and tribes, that you may recognize one another. The best among you in the sight of God is the most righteous. God is omniscient, cognizant." So slavery has been gradually abolished by Islam. It did not come by decree or injunction, but rather in the form of total management principles, which were applied during the early periods of Islam and still applicable today if necessary. Slavery has long been practiced before the coming of Islam. In the pre-Islamic Egyptian, Jewish, Greek and Roman society, slavery was in full use in different aspects. Aristotle subscribed to the idea that men were born not to be equal, as some will become master due to their superior brain power and intellectual capacity, while others will become slaves. The approach taken by Islam is full of wisdom and at the same time provides a package of proactive measures to eliminate this practice. It is a gradual but effective approach which combines several affirmative measures. The main strategy is to narrow down the sources of slavery, with a view to eliminating it altogether and opening a wide avenue for slaves to gain independence. People became slaves because of criminal actions, unpaid debts, gambling, kidnapping, piracy, irresponsible parents who sold their children into slavery, being descendants of slaves, prisoners of war, and voluntary submission to be a slave in order to get out from the miseries of life, such as acute poverty. These were effectively reduced by Islam. The provision of slavery through wars was no longer important after the Islamic civilization. redefined the mode of interaction between nations from power struggle to peaceful and productive coexistence. Indirectly, but effectively, Islam has closed this source of slavery. Islam opened all the doors to free the slaves by setting up rules which greatly facilitated the emancipation of slaves. The initiative of Islam is promoting independence of slaves was carried out in the following ways: encouraging the masters and the Muslim societies at large to help in freeing the slaves. The act of freeing the slave is considered a noble one which is highly valued by God. The slaves themselves entered into an agreement with their master to buy their independence by paying certain amounts of money. The society was encouraged to help in providing the freedom money. Chapter 24 verse 33, those who cannot afford to get married shall maintain morality until God provides for them from his grace. This among your servants who wish to be freed in order to marry, you shall grant them their wish once you realize that they are honest, and give them from God's money that he has bestowed upon you. So making the act of freeing the slave a part of punishment for any criminal act, as well as for non-conformity of the Islamic rituals. There are several verses in the Holy Quran which specifically mention the requirement of freeing a slave as a way of meeting the punishment for wrongdoing. You can see chapter 4 verse 92, chapter 5 verse 89 and chapter 58 verse 3. Using charity and money as a financial source to free the slave. Chapter 9 verse 60, charity shall go to the poor, the needy, the workers who collect them, the new converts to free the slaves, to those burdened by sudden expenses in the cause of God, and to the travelling alien. Such is God's commandment. God is omniscient, most wise. Chapter 2 verse 177, righteousness is not turning your face towards the east or the west. Righteousness are those who believe in God on the last day, the angels, the scripture and the prophets, and they give their money cheerfully to the relatives, the orphans, the needy, the travelling alien, the beggars, and to free the slaves. And they observe the salat, the following closely to the divine system, and giving the obligatory zakat, the purity, and they keep their word whenever they make a promise, and they steadfastly preserve in the face of persecution, hardship and war. These are the truthful, these are the righteous. In chapter 90 verse 10 to 13, did we not show him the two paths? He should choose the difficult path. Which one is the difficult path? The freeing of the slaves. Finally, we can say that Islam found the slavery system already existing and put forward a plan to abolish it. No slaves or free the slaves. Some people question why God in the Quran did not prohibit slavery and instead commanded and rewarded the freeing of the slaves. God the Almighty knows that slavery is a social disease that will persist as long as humans are present on earth. If the order in the Quran is to prohibit slavery, it would be a noble command, but since only the believers in the Quran would be the ones following the Quran, the command would not help slavery outside Islam. Every Muslim would then free his slaves and remind other Muslims not to have slaves anymore, and their duties stop at that. So the command in the Quran to free the slaves does not stop at the Muslims or Islam, but extend to all the slaves wherever they are. A Muslim would therefore free any slaves he might have had, and after that turns to any other slaves in any location and of any religion to free, as commanded by God in the Quran. In other words, the command to free the slaves is far more reaching and far more effective than the mere order to stop having slaves. Van den Berg, a non-Muslim historian, says many regulations have been made by Islam showing how noble was the feeling of the Prophet Muhammad and his followers towards slaves. In those regulations, we find that the merits of Islam are contrary to all the systems used until recently by nations who claim to be most civilized and developed. Islam never became a force nor a party that promoted and condoned slavery. A balanced analysis of this issue would recognize the wisdom of Islam in managing the heinous practice of slavery and effectively putting an end to it. Obviously, don't listen to me, verify everything for yourself and stop blind following. You are working for the elites, the very same elites that has caused all this slavery, the prime example of a divide and conquer technique. So as I said, people, I say I'm not here to attack anyone, just giving you the information, putting it out there for you to listen to it. So now we're going to talk about slavery in Hadith, Paul's Christianity. So I call the New Testament Paul's Hadith, his sayings. So let's go through them and just let's see what it says, the Christians that follow this today. So those who criticise the Islamic legislation towards slavery are holding those views because they analyse the process of that Islam used to abolish it, using a tunnel vision. In other words, they failed to see the big picture, in which this process not only completely abolished slavery from the Muslim world, but the approach was the most humane and most peaceful method ever employed for this task. Dr. George Breest, a non-Muslim historian, says Christianity did not object to slavery politically or economically. It did not encourage the believers to oppose the traditions of their generations as regards slavery. Christianity did not even discuss the problem and said nothing against the rights of slave owners. It did not urge slaves to demand their freedom and did not basically ask to free the slaves. In the Grand Larousse of 19th century, one reads, "Man does not wonder at the presence of slavery and its being common among the Christians till now. The religious representatives approve it and believe that it is legal. In brief, Christianity approves it completely till our time, and it is very hard to prove that Christianity tried to abolish slavery. It is no wonder that Christians continue to practice slavery until very recently. In the less than 50 years, Western slave traders carried to North and South Africa slaves, who now number about 20 million people, left after killing and oppression." So this number is 5 times that of the slaves in the ancient world more than 1,000 years ago, and the difference between the slaves of the ancient world and the new world is so great that these people in America are still a race of secluded pedigree, or of lesser privilege and no practical rights. One does not find this in any nation of the East. A black man who comes to any country that is considered a citizen in about 1 generation. He has the same rights and duties and needs no protection by legislation or law. In Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 2, page 779, under 1 reads, "Catching slaves from their villages, which were surrounded by jungle, happened this way. Fire was started in the dry hedges surrounding the huts, and when the residents fled away into the jungle, the Englishman caught them in device prepared for that purpose. Some of the people died during the human hunt on their way to the coast to the ships of the British and other companies. A third of the remaining captives died because of climate alteration, and during the shipping 4.5% died and 90% died during the journey. Those who died in the colonies were uncountable." And this goes for the Africans, tribal leaders at that time, that was allowing all this to happen and actually bringing them to the Englishmen, Europeans. So in 1502, about 800,000 slaves entered the colony of Jamaica alone, and only 340,000 were alive at the end of the same year. Queen Elizabeth, the first was partner in the slave trade. Her partner was John Hawkins, the greatest slave dealer in history. She made him a knight because she admired his courage and made a coat of arms a slave in chains and handcuffs. It is really ironic to read that ship which the Queen prepared for Hawkins was called Jesus, and the ships made for the slave trade numbered 192, and each ship could hold 146 slaves. England asked the clergy to find documents to justify this trade, and they readily enough found the texts from the Old Testament which were mentioned above under slavery and Jews. The Bible, unlike the Holy Quran, widely promoted the institution of slavery. Muslims cannot believe that God could have inspired the following on the issue of slavery found in the Bible. "Let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be defamed." Timothy 1, chapter 6, verse 1. "As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around about you." Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44. "If a man lies carnally with a woman who is a slave betrothed to another man, and not yet ransomed or given her freedom, and inquiry shall be held, they shall not be put to death, because she was not free." Leviticus chapter 19, verse 20. "When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or 2, he is not to be punished, for the slave is his money." Exodus chapter 21, verse 20-21. "And the Lord said, when you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it, and if its answer to you is peace and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you." Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 10-11. "And he said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant." Genesis chapter 9, verse 26. So the Canaanites have dwelt in the midst of Ephraim to this day, but become slaves to do forced labor. Joshua chapter 16 verse 10. And all the people that were left of the Aramites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, if I'm saying it, Jebusites, which were not the children of Israel, the children that were left after them in the land, whom the children of Israel also were not able to utterly destroy. Upon those did Solomon levy a tribute of bond service unto this day. Number 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 20-21. But every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. Exodus chapter 12 verse 44. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. Exodus chapter 21 verse 2. St. Paul asked the slaves to obey their masters as they obey Jesus Christ. In his message to the people of Ephesus, St. Paul said, O slave, obey your masters in body with fear and trembling in your hearts as you do for Christ, not deceiving the eye as those who please people, but as slaves of Christ, working God's will, serving with God intention, as for God, not for people, knowing that whatever good you do, it will be accepted by God, whether you were free or slave. St. Peter made a similar recommendation, ordered priests to adhere to it, because slavery is a redemption of human errors offered by men for the wrath of the greatest Lord. St. Thomas Aquinas added the philosophical view to the view of religious leaders and did not object to slavery but praised it, because he, like his teacher Aristotle, believed that slavery was natural case and some people are originally born to be slaves. Also, he believed slavery did not contradict the faith and humans should be satisfied with the lowly lot. Perhaps the above verses in the Bible were the thoughts of man, as the Bible itself claims. How can you say we are wise and the law of the Lord is with us? Behold, the false pen of the scribes turned it into a lie. Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 8. And the burden of your Lord shall you mention no more, for you have perverted the words of the living God. Jeremiah 23 verse 36. Behold, the word of the Lord is unto them a reproach. They have no delight in it. From the least of them even unto the greatest of them, everyone is given to covertness, and from the prophet even unto the priest, everyone deals falsely. Jeremiah chapter 6 verse 10. The prophet's prophecy lies in the name. I sent them not, neither have I commanded them, neither spoke unto them. Jeremiah chapter 14 verse 14. They use their tongues and say, he says. Jeremiah 23 verse 31. Many years after Jesus left the earth, Paul says about the Old Testament and the New Testament, but when that which is perfect is come, taken that which is in part shall be done away. Number 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 9. The good news to mankind is that God has revealed the Holy Quran, a perfect revelation and a mercy for mankind. Whenever you want to pursue the truth and verify anything you hear about Islam, we urge you to please use the only valid and divine source of submission, which is the Quran, which you will find the Quran in the book Al-Kitab. So I hope that's helped everyone out, and I hope that's shed a bit of light. I think you lot need to wake up really and look at actually who's behind this and educate yourself. Until next time, peace.
May those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots. May humanity never again perpetrate such injustice against humanity, and we, the living, vow to uphold this. Slave exit to waiting boat. As we walk out the castle, we all carry a lot of responsibilities. Right. We are just going to preach against injustice. Mm-hmm. And from now onwards, we see ourselves as brothers. This plaque was brought by the National House of Chiefs as a mission statement of the whole tour of the castle.
what role did they kind of play in keeping this slave trade going?
The chiefs were there, and then this slavery stuff was going on. Mm-hmm. So people are of the view that some of the chiefs also participated. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is why they brought this, to show us like apology of what some of their predecessors also did. Yeah.
Rights. Boy, everyone in this country is always running around yammering about their fucking rights. I have a right, you have no right, we have a right, they don't have a right. Folks, I hate to spoil your fun, but there's no such thing as rights, okay? They're imaginary. We made them up, like the boogeyman. The Three Little Pigs, Pinocchio, Mother Goose, shit like that. Rights are an idea. They're just imaginary. They're a cute idea, cute, but that's all, cute and fictional. But if you think you do have rights, let me ask you this. Where do they come from? People say, well, they come from God. They're God-given rights. Oh, fuck, here we go again. Here we go again. The God excuse, the last refuge of a man with no answers and no argument, it came from God. Anything we can't describe must have come from God. Personally, folks, I believe that if your rights came from God, he would have given you the right to some food every day, and he would have given you the right to a roof over your head. God would have been looking out for you. God would have been looking out for you. You know that? He wouldn't have been worried about making sure you have a gun so you can get drunk on Sunday night and kill your girlfriend's parents. But let's say it's true. Let's say God gave us these rights. Why would he give us a certain number of rights? The Bill of Rights in this country has 10 stipulations, okay? 10 rights. And apparently God was doing sloppy work that week because we've had to amend the Bill of Rights an additional 17 times. So God forgot a couple of things like slavery. Just fucking slipped his mind. But let's say God gave us the original 10. He gave the British 13. The British Bill of Rights has 13 stipulations. The Germans have 29. The Belgians have 25. The Swedish have only 6. And some people in the world have no rights at all. What kind of a fucking goddamn God-given deal is that? No rights at all? Why would God give different people in different countries different numbers of different rights? Boredom? Amusement? Bad arithmetic? Do we find out at long last after all this time that God is weak in math skills? Doesn't sound like divine planning to me. Sounds more like human planning. Sounds more like one group trying to control another group. In other words, business as usual in America. Now, if you think you do have rights, one last assignment for you. Next time you're at the computer, get on the internet, go to Wikipedia. When you get to Wikipedia, in the search field for Wikipedia, I want you to type in Japanese Americans 1942, and you'll find out all about your precious fucking rights, okay? All right. You know about it. You know about it. In 1942, there were 110,000 Japanese American citizens and good-standing, law-abiding people who were thrown into internment camps simply because their parents were born in the wrong country. That's all they did wrong. They had no right to a lawyer, no right to a fair trial, no right to a jury of their peers, no right to due process of any kind. The only right they had, right this way, into the internment camps. Just when these American citizens needed their rights the most, their government took them away. And rights aren't rights if someone can take them away. They're privileges. That's all we've ever had in this country is a bill of temporary privileges. And if you read the news even badly, you know that every year the list gets shorter and shorter and shorter. You see how sooner or later? Yeah. Sooner or later, the people in this country are going to realize the government does not give a fuck about them. Government doesn't care about you or your children or your rights or your welfare or your safety. It simply doesn't give a fuck about you. It's interested in its own power. That's the only thing, keeping it and expanding it wherever possible. Personally, when it comes to rights, I think one of two things is true. I think either we have unlimited rights or we have no rights at all. Personally, I lean toward unlimited rights. I feel, for instance, I have the right to do anything I please. But if I do something you don't like, I think you have the right to kill me. So where are you going to find a fairer fucking deal than that? So the next time some asshole says to you, I have a right to my opinion, you say, oh yeah, well I have a right to my opinion, and my opinion is you have no right to your opinion.
So, how are we slaves to the system? Well, millions and live and die and never know that their lives are regulated by unseen authority. Every detail of our lives is prescribed. Doctors, lawyers, Indians or chiefs, we are all regimented into the system. So what is the system? It is the totality of laws, regulations, social pressures and morality which regulate our lives, including our very thoughts. Some call the system democracy, some call the system Americanism. Most believe that we are free and that our freedom evolved from the Constitution. Our lives are an expression of the confluence, obviously the blending of influences of the establishment. We do not feel or see the regimentation and the bridled force that programs our lives to produce for the system which George Orwell called Big Brother. We unconsciously give our minds and bodies to the system. We literally give our labour for numbers on pieces of paper that some influence told us was money. Through force and regulation, these numbers imply confidence that we can exchange for bread. The illusion is compounded when we are forced to return some of the numbers to the government as taxes. Yes, we live and die with abstract numbers, which the system has taught us is money. But the system has not taught us or revealed to us that the system created these numbers. They cost the system nothing. These numbers that we sell our bodies and souls for is the heartbeat of the system. No one dare inquire into the source of these numbers. The fraud and deceit is too big to discuss, too powerful to challenge, and too incredible to imagine. The system has admitted any challenge to itself. So what is the force that cements the system? It is the police power. Government is police power. Government by definition, by nature, by history and by practical existence is police power. Government would not and could not exist without police power. When governments lose their police power, they collapse. Every act of government and its politicians is motivated by its police power. Government police power is awesome, and it is a hush-hush subject. So let's go to the Black's Law Dictionary. Police power is the power of the state to place restraints on the personal freedom and property rights of persons for the protection of the public safety, health and morals, or the promotion of the public convenience and general prosperity. The police power is subject to limitations of the federal and state constitutions, and especially to the requirements of due process. Police power is the exercise of the sovereign right of a government to promote order, safety, security, health, morals and general welfare within constitutional limits, and is an essential attribute of government. Police policy. What is police policy? The term police policy is a very innocent and disarming term, which in reality is the very opposite of the public impression. Police policy is a system in writing and practice. Public policy is actually the police power in action. It's the manifestation of police power, the implementation of government force. Back to Black's Law Dictionary on public policy, that principle of the law which holds that no subject that's you can lawfully do that which has a tendency to be injurious to the public or against the public good. The principles under which the freedom of contract or private dealings is restricted by law for the good of the community. Obviously the term policy as applied to a statute, regulation, rule of law, course of action or the like refers to its probable effect, tendency or object considered with reference to the social or political well-being of the state. There you have it, a police state. Do not be deceived by mention in Black Law's dictionary definition to limitations of the federal and state constitutions. Police power is not limited and does not come about by due process, but by usurpation and wrongful seizure of your mind, your body and your wealth through deception. If you read this Black Law's dictionary definition closely, you will see that the interest of the state in all matters prevails over you, the individual. When politicians and bureaucrats talk about democracy and public policy, they speak with a forked tongue. They want you to believe that these terms refer to personal liberty. They do not. And the politician knows that they do not. They know that they refer to the police power and enforcement of state authority over the individual. They are code words for government force. Government is not reason, it's not eloquence, it is force, like fire. It's a dangerous servant and a fearful master. This is what George Washington said. Police power is a physical force. If you fail to file and pay your income tax, you will be introduced to the police power of the government. I use the terms pay and income tax in the vernacular, not in the monetary realism sense, as we have discussed. But look, the police power limited to physical force and intimidation can be overthrown even by citizens who have no guns. To limit our definition of police power to physical force would indeed make this discussion as frivolous and childish as Ned in the first reader. So police power goes far beyond the definition given above from Black's Law Dictionary. We speak to the subtle and hidden power of government to persuade the public mind. Government persuasion is the indoctrination of the individual through his church, his public school, through his the media, to sacrifice his person, his individuality and his property for the greater good of the group. Group is translated government authority. So once we yield our minds to government force under the pretense of the greater good or the national interest, there is no need to concern ourselves with the right to bear arms. In our schools and college history classes, we learn about they abolished the slavery in America. However, we learn nothing about the nationalisation of slavery with police power as outlined above. Statutory freedom shackled with mental marriage to the beast is a study in the pathology of the public mind. This means that we are given certain freedoms by the way of Constitution and the Bill of Rights on one hand and brainwashed into servitude on the other. Police power is sovereignty and of this obviously over the state of mind, body and soul. To believe otherwise is to live by illusion. This is why the Quran tells you that it's come for the individual. You have to use your reasoning, your common sense, your faculties that God gave you, and not to follow the herd. And this is what a lot of people are doing nowadays, are just following the herd. Just like the BLM, EDL, you're just same face on same coin, to be honest with you. You know, you're doing exactly the same actions as what they're doing exactly the same, and you're working for the government. This is the government's trick, divide and conquer. You need to wake up, you need to stop it, and we need to unite. And this is the only way the government are ever going to listen to us, if we unite under one banner. Forget the problems we have with gender and different, with religion. We can get to all that once we have our own way. And our own way is by coming together and not letting the elites control us. But unfortunately, the majority of Earth is bending over and dropping their trousers for the elites. There's only so much we can do. So, in these times, may God guide everyone to the Quran alone, the true Quran alone, and give you understanding. Subscribe to my channel, pass it around if you think there's, any information. If you're gonna, start dropping comments and, saying, yeah, but this, yeah, but that, I advise you first to go and verify what I'm saying. Yeah, verify everything that I'm saying, and then come to your own conclusions. Stop following the herd, stop blind following, stop listening to the media, yeah, etc, etc. This has all been implanted into you, whether it's the EDL, the BLM, the Antifa, LGBT, whatever groups come up. They're all running off the back of the same slave master, and we're all slaves today. So on that note, peace everyone, and may God keep you safe.